Hi everyone, and welcome to another of Moonee Valley Library's online author talks. My name's Kelvin, and I work for Moonee Valley Libraries. Tonight we have a leading Australian crime fiction novelist, Chris Hammer, talking about his latest novel, Silver, and giving some insights to his follow-up, Trust, which is due out in October. Before I proceed any further, I would like to respectfully acknowledge on behalf of Moonee Valley City Council the traditional custodians of this land I'm currently broadcasting from, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, their spirits, ancestors, elders and community members past and present. Moonee Valley is proud of its diverse community and acknowledges the contributions that all people make to this vibrant and inclusive municipality. Before Chris begins, I'd like to give you a little background on him. He was a journalist for 30 years, including as an overseas correspondent for SBS Television. He's also been a chief political correspondent for The Bulletin and a senior writer and online editor of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Chris has written two non-fiction books, The River in 2010 and The Coast in 2012, both on the Australian landscape, and both were well received. His first novel, Scrublands, was an instant bestseller, as was his follow-up, Silver. In the UK, Scrublands was named the Sunday Times Crime Novel of the Year in 2019 and won the prestigious British Crime Writers Association John Creasy New Blood Dagger Award. Next in the series is Trust, which is due to be published in October 13. Please welcome Chris Hammer.
Hello, everyone. So nice to be with you. Particularly in this cold weather. I'm here in Canberra, and I know most of the people watching are from Moonee Valley or from Melbourne generally. So first thing to say is we've all been thinking of you down there. I just, in this period of lockdown, so hopefully I can provide at least some sort of entertainment in this time. I was down there right at the end of June 30th. I drove down and picked up my son who was at Melbourne Uni, and we managed to sort of get back here by then. So thank you so much to Moonee Valley Libraries for inviting me to give a talk about Silver. And it's actually quite good timing. This is the Silver you've probably seen. I'm not sure if that's the right way around or not. But in like 2 weeks or something, this one comes out, which is the sort of smaller version. It's the one that you get in Big W and Kmart, and that's half the price. And also, it's been out in hardback in England. So this one here, that's the new English paperback. So that's just about to come out too. So it's quite a topical time to be talking about Silver. I thought I'd start by describing how I came to how I came to write Silver, and really I can't do that without talking about Scrublands, my first book, which was published just about 2 years ago, July 2018. But with Scrublands, it took me quite a long time to write, about 5 years. I'm guessing it's about 5 years. Now, it wasn't 5 years full-time because I had a full-time job then. I was still working for Fairfax, Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, here in Canberra in the Press Gallery. And I, had family responsibilities. And, I just wrote the book over, as I'd say, 4 or 5 years as a bit of a hobby. And then around 3 years ago, July 2017, I had these two big sort of life-changing incidents. The first was I got sacked along with a lot of other people at Fairfax. But the other thing is I got this amazing book deal through Scrublands. I had a fantastic agent, and I got a deal for Scrublands here in Australia and internationally, the US, the UK, in translations, whatever. It was, as I say, completely life-changing. It's like any aspiring writer's dream come true. But there was an important factor in this, in that both the Australian publishers, Allen and Unwin, and the UK publishers, Wildfire, they were both 2 book contracts. And the Australian one was pretty open. It was for Scrublands and a second book. The UK one was more specific. It was for UK and a second Martin Scarsden book. So when I came to write Silver, I already kind of knew what it was about, that it was going to be, once again, involve Martin Scarsden. Now, I've got to say, that was absolutely fine by me, because I intended to write another book like that anyway. Partly because I'd had this mad idea when I started writing Scrublands that I might write a trilogy. Now, I sort of have Scrublands, Silver, and now Trust. But I had this idea, rather than 3 books that are separate but linked, so you can read Silver as a standalone. You don't have to have read Scrublands. And the same with Trust. You don't have to have read the previous 2 books. It's probably better and probably more enjoyable if you do, but it's still possible, unlike a real trilogy. Anyway, that mad idea had got washed out pretty early on in the editing process, even really before I had a publisher. But it meant that I still had plenty of ideas about what to do with Martin. So that was fine. And I thought, yeah, I can do a second book. But then what happened, Scrublands was published in July 2018. And a month or 2 later, my publisher, the wonderful Jane Palfreyman, one of the, probably the most accomplished publisher in Australia, publisher of all these Miles Franklin award winners, and for some reason she's doing my crime books, which I'm forever grateful for. But she said to me, how are you going with the follow-up book? And I was going, oh yeah, all right, I've sort of got a few ideas, I'm batting them around. She says, yeah, because it'd be really good if we had it out next year. And I went, oh right, because Scrublands had taken 4 or 5 years, right? I'm thinking, can I do it again, but can I possibly do it inside a year? So I sort of said, well, this is probably about September, maybe 2018. I said, oh, when do you have it in mind? And she said, oh, well, we probably aim to publish in October next year. So that was October 2019. And I thought, oh, okay, well, yeah, that gives me a bit of extra time. When would you like to see a manuscript by? And she says, February. So this is already like September, okay? I'm thinking, holy cow, it's not writing a book in a year. It's writing a book in 5 or 6 months. As I say, I had some ideas, I was working on a plot, but so it was really, the pressure was kind of on. But there was an important thing for me to remember, and Jane said very clearly, look, if it's not ready, we're not going to publish it. We don't want to publish a book that's going to fail. If you need more time, you get more time. But what I understood was the October publication date was a really big compliment to me, because if a book comes out in October, it's a Christmas book, and that's when the big books come out. It's the time you get the best sales. And Allen and Unwin publish maybe 250 books a year. So to be one of the selected to come out at that sort of prime time, September, October, November, in Australia at any rate, is the prime time for books to come out. So I thought, well, I'm going to give it a go. I'll try and deliver on time. But also, of course, it gave me a deadline to work to, and I did. So I'd had this idea of setting a book on the coast. So in November, I went up to the north coast of New South Wales for a while. I spent some time in a town called Yamba. Port Silver isn't really based on Yamba, but if you went looking, there's probably some elements there. And I spent a few weeks up there just writing and researching furiously. And then after Christmas, I really spent 2 months writing absolutely full time, barricaded away, didn't have anything to drink got out for an hour a day to do some exercise. That was about it. So it was kind of hard, but on the other hand, it was also kind of madly enjoyable because I was on this mission. I had this big chance. Scrublands was doing well, and I had a chance to kind of follow up and see if I could do it again, see if it wasn't just a fluke. So, how different was it for me writing Silver after writing Scrublands? Well, there's a couple of the time, just the time, the concentrated time was the big difference, of course. But there were some other sort of interesting differences too. And the first was, okay, Scrublands had taken me quite a bit of time to write, but I was really learning on the job. I'd been a journalist for many years, so I had some of the disciplines, but I'd never done a creative writing course. I wasn't a member of any writing groups. I wasn't, a member of the local writers' centre or anything like that. So in Scrublands, I was pretty much learning on the job, and I wasted a lot of time. I threw out enormous amounts of words, partly abandoning that Nutso trilogy idea. But I reckon I would have thrown out easily 200,000 words. Scrublands is a big book. It's about 125,000 words, but I would have thrown out close to twice that amount, just getting it right. Okay, so that was something I didn't want to do again, and maybe I'd learnt from. I think in writing a book, any book, there's 2 or 3 components that you need to have to do it. And the first is simply the application and the self-discipline to sit down and write. And there's a lot of aspiring writers who find that difficult. I know when I was younger, I had the attention span of a gnat, so writing a book was always going to be hard. But, I'd written 2 non-fiction books. I'd written Scrublands. I knew I could do that. And what's more, I didn't really need the self-discipline because I had the discipline of this deadline. So that was easy. Then there's a whole bunch of what you might call craft skills. How to write dialogue, how to get the pacing right, how not to overstate things. Probably the most important one of those in my mind is just being self-aware or aware of what's working in your manuscript and what isn't, so you don't waste time polishing something that you eventually throw out. And I think that is one thing that a lot of successful writers have in common. They might be writing completely different styles, fiction, non-fiction, whatever, but they have to be their own best editors. But there's another part of writing a book, which is just that intuitive side, the creative side, the ideas that bubble up from nowhere. If it wasn't for that, of course, everyone's books would be incrementally better. Every book would be better than the last as you got better at the craft skills. So I had to have these sort of, that was the thing I was worried about. But yeah, that went along well. And of course, I also knew that once I'd finished the manuscript and got it in the best condition I could get, I'd have some really good editors to work with. Now, as I was starting to write Silver, there's a couple of things that I did want to include and a few things that I'd learnt from Scrublands. When I started writing Scrublands, and I thought, I'll have a go at writing a crime novel, I was thinking the most important thing in any crime novel has to be the plot, the whodunit, the big reveal at the end, right? But one of the things that I learnt, I think, in writing Scrublands that almost came as a surprise to me, but one of the things I found most satisfying, and I think a lot of readers like too, was the kind of emotional side of the story, and particularly Martin Scarsden's own emotional journey. So the Martin at the end of the Scrublands is different from the Martin at the start. He's becoming more self-aware. He's no longer so uncaring. He's more empathetic. He's more vulnerable. He realises he's more vulnerable. And he's also starting to question the ethics of some of his behaviour in the past as a journalist. So he's starting to come to terms with his post-traumatic stress and a few other issues. And I like that about Scrublands. So I wanted to do something similar in Silver, or, not the same, same but different, if that makes sense. And that's what really gave me the kernel, I think, for Silver, Martin's emotional journey. And and I got the idea of, well, let's find out what's made him who he is, what brought him to be the person he was at the start of Scrublands. So I had this idea, let's take him back to his hometown, which is Port Silver, and let's find out what's been so traumatic to make him the man he is. And I think I was already having these sort of ideas as I was completing Scrublands. You go through all these sort of editing process with a book. There's a structural edit, there's a copy edit, there's a proof edit. So by the time I was finishing the proof edit, I already had the kernel of the idea for Silver. And you can tell because there's a line right near the end of Scrublands. Martin is standing on the bridge where he first came into the town of Riversend, and he's there, and there's the empty riverbed, and he sheds a tear, and it says it's the first time he's cried since he was 8 years old. And so Silver, a big part of Silver, is finding out exactly what did happen when he was 8 years old. So that gave me a kind of emotional kernel. So I knew by the end of Silver we were going to know what had happened to him as a kid and what had happened to his family. Then I needed a setting, and the setting for Scrublands is very effective, this drought-ravaged town out on the hay plain in the middle of nowhere. And it helps explain the characters in the book and their motivations. Desperate people do desperate things in desperate times. But I couldn't set another book in Riversend because anything that could possibly have happened in that town had happened and been described in Scrublands. So I had this idea, okay, instead of a town that's desperate with all the pressure on it, let's try and have the opposite. Instead of desperation and economic disaster, let's have prosperity, let's have boom times, or at least the promise of it, imminent. So a boom sort of town. And that's where I got the idea for Port Silver as being the next Noosa or the next Byron Bay. Now, because I live in Canberra, I'm far more familiar with the south coast of New South Wales, down past Bateman's Bay and Maruya and, Bermagui. It's a beautiful town. There's probably bits of Bermagui in Port Silver, but it's never going to be a boom town because it's not far enough north. The sea's cold for too long. There's no big cities next to it. So I invented this town up there on the coast. And the idea of having the prosperity helped explain the motivation of many of the characters, that there was going to be a real estate boom. So there's people manoeuvring to get in on the ground floor. So I thought, well, that's good. So I had a couple of elements there. I had the idea of greed and avarice, which are kind of like thematic stuff. I had a setting. I had this idea of Martin's childhood. Then I needed to sort of crime, if you like. I needed the crime element. Now, one of my problems here is in the vocabulary of crime writers, I'm far more of a pantser than a plotter. Now, I know that some of you are going to know what I mean by that, but essentially, pantsers write by the seat of their pants. They start a story, they don't know where it's going. And there's a lot of very successful writers who are like that. Lee Child's like that. Michael Rowbotham is like that, surprisingly, given how intricate and nuanced his books are. Then you get people who plot stuff out and write it. Jane Harper is one of those. James Elroy is probably the most famous. But because I was a bit of a pantser, I wanted to start this story without quite knowing where it was going, which is a bit difficult given the short deadline I had. But what I decided straight off the top was, one of the things that had worked well in Scrublands was there's 3 or 4 or 5 different plot lines, and they're all sort of interacting. So I thought that's good because it's good for the reader, because there's nothing worse in a crime book if you get halfway through and you guess the ending. And similarly, one of the things that's possibly even worse is you get 10 pages from the end and suddenly there's a new character introduced and a whole lot of new information, which means that there's no way you could have guessed the ending. The perfect ending, of course, is one that once it's revealed comes as a surprise, but when you look back, it all makes complete sense. If you've got 3 or 4 or 5 different plot lines, well, no one's going to guess all of them. And including me, really, because as a pantser, sometimes I really don't know how I'm going to resolve things. And again, in Silver, I wrote it, I resolved everything, and then just in the first edit, I got a better idea. So once again, I tossed the last 30,000 words of the book and rewrote them because the ending was more satisfying. So there are differences in Silver. I was determined that I wouldn't just keep repeating the same book again. Scrublands is very successful. I'm very proud of it. But if you keep writing the same book, people are going to get, just get sick of reading the same thing. So the big difference, I guess, is we get to see Martin's background, his history, his family history, why he is how he is. The other things is there's different motivations. In Scrublands, Martin is a complete outsider. He's never been to the town of Riversend before, and he's motivated by one thing, and that's to get a good newspaper story. And the newspaper story he does changes while he's in Riversend, but the motivation is the same. Silver is different. First up, he's not an outsider. This is his old hometown. He still has relatives there. There are other people in the town that still remember him. But perhaps more importantly, his motivations are more mixed. This is not a spoiler. I think probably many of you have read the book, but he arrives in the first chapter to find his old best friend from school, Jasper Spate, dead on the floor of his partner Mandy's apartment. And he's been knifed to death, and Mandy's sitting a few metres away with blood on her hands, and of course she's suspected of the murder. So Martin initially is motivated by wanting to clear Mandy's name, but then as the story goes along, of course he realises, hey, there is a cracking newspaper story to be found here. And so he starts pursuing that, and at times there's a bit of mixed motivations there. There is a lot going on there in the plot, though, I must say. There's all sorts of stuff. There's real estate intrigues, as I said, and there's murders, new ones and old ones and historical ones, and there's poaching, and there's drugs, and there's a guru and his followers, there's shark attacks, there's an environmental battle going on about, well, depending on who you ask, a wetlands or a swamp. There's a native title claim. There's a television celebrity. The media's in town chasing the story of the murders and the celebrity. There's dodgy police. There's family loyalties. There's even a sex for visa scam happening. So there's a lot going on. So I hope readers enjoy the ride, but at the same time, get some satisfaction out of that sort of emotional heart that's at the book. Now, we're probably just about time for questions, but before we start, I should also point out this, because I just got this like about 2 days ago. This is the New Book Trust, and this is the one that, this is the final version. So it's just, they're just starting to run off some early copies. It's not out until October 13th. And it's again Martin and Mandy, but it's actually quite different again from the first 2 books. I think if people like Scrublands and Silver, they're definitely going to like Trust. The difference is the first 2 books are all told almost exclusively from Martin's point of view. It's not told in the first person, it's third person, but Martin is in every scene. And you can read what he's thinking, but you only have the impressions of what other people are thinking. In Trust, the chapters alternate. Martin's point of view, then Mandy's point of view. And because of that, the chapters need to be a bit shorter. There's more going on, so it's a bit pacier. And it's probably leans a little bit more to being more like a thriller than the first 2 books. So that's coming out. Happy to answer a few questions about that, but obviously, still 6 weeks or something away. I'm not going to, there'll be no spoilers for Trust. Anyway, Kelvin, how am I doing? We good for questions?
We haven't got any questions so far, so I'd encourage you to put some into the Q&A section. I've got a few questions though. One is you've had a 30-year career as a journalist. I'm just wondering and a lot of journalists tend to go towards non-fiction rather than fiction. What skills from journalism do you think you've been able to use to write fiction?
Yeah, it's true that a lot of journalists do non-fiction, and I did 2 non-fiction books. But again, there's a lot of journalists who have become crime writers. One of the reasons I think I became a crime writer was because when I was at uni back in the 80s in Bathurst, my writing teacher was a bloke called Peter Temple that you might have heard of, back before he wrote any fiction, the author of the Jack Irish books and famously The Broken Shore and Truth. Michael Rowbotham was a journalist, Michael Connolly was a journalist, Jane Harper was a journalist, all crime writers. The interesting thing about all of those is they don't typically use a journalist as a protagonist in the way I do. They use police. Michael Rowbotham, of course, uses a psychologist. Michael Connolly does have a journalist that he uses occasionally, but his main character is Harry Bosch. What journalism gives you is, I guess, a discipline of writing, knowing that you can't wait around for inspiration. Imagine as a journalist if you rang up your editor one day and said, I don't think I'll file today, I'm not feeling inspired, well, you'd get the heave-ho very quickly. One thing I find is I spent quite a lot of time as a television journalist, and I go away for weeks for SBS, and I come back and I have all my tapes, and I transcribe interviews. So you're listening to people speaking all the time. So when I was in the press gallery, listening to politicians and picking out that one little grab that's on the evening news, what you realise is people don't speak grammatically. They start sentences, they don't know where they're going to happen. Politicians reiterate themselves all the time as they're trying to think of the next thing to say. So I think maybe that gave me a bit of an ear for how people speak. Dialogue in books is a bit tricky because you want the impression that it's kind of natural speech, but you actually want it much more cleaner and shorter. So it's a bit of a mix. A lot of authors, I was a bit surprised when I heard this, but I've run into quite a few authors who say they have problems with dialogue. I actually like writing dialogue. It often takes me off into different directions where I haven't expected.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got a question. How much of Chris is in the Martin Scarsden character?
Well, I hope not a lot. I mean, Martin is he's younger than me, obviously, but he's about 40 and he hasn't had an adult relationship by the start of Scrublands. He's quite a damaged character. He's got PTSD. I've got, none of those. I've got, been married for 25 years. But I did 2 long stints working for Dateline at SBS. I'd go overseas, do these long stories. Most of the time, I was just off by myself, but occasionally I'd run into the international press pack, the war correspondents, the dying days of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, in the Middle East, in Bosnia. And some of them are very badly damaged, particularly actually the camera operators and the photographers, self-medicating. They parachute in, they parachute out. Ethically, some of them are a bit questionable. So Martin is much more based on those people that I met working as a journalist than on myself.
Okay, and probably a related question: how did the character Martin come to you? Why did you decide to use that as a basis for the Martin character?
Part of it was so when I started writing Scrublands, I'd written these non-fiction books earlier, and they taught me 3 things, if you like. One, I could do it. I could actually write a book and get it published. The second thing was really important was I really liked writing books. A lot of people like the idea of being an author, but they don't like the work, but I found I did. And the third thing it taught me is there's no money in writing it. I couldn't make a living. As it transpires, that's wrong, but that's what I thought. So I had this job. I didn't really have time, I thought, to go and research how a police officer works or, a forensic pathologist or any of that. What I knew was journalists. So I thought, and, some of these guys I met, mainly men, some women, these war correspondent types were interesting and intriguing. But also, I think with Scrublands, one of the first ideas I had was I had the setting from when I'd written some non-fiction books, was going to this town and doing an anniversary story on some terrible event. In Scrublands, it's the murder by a priest of some of his parishioners. And I'd done some stories like that. I went to Aceh a year after the tsunami, for example. But the one that really sticks in my mind was I went to a little town in East Texas called Jasper. It wasn't a year after, it was about 3 or 6 months after some white supremacists had murdered an African-American man by tying him to the back of a pickup truck and dragging him to death. But there was no mystery about who killed him. They were all arrested by that stage, later executed. And that story was actually, the town was racially divided. So my story was about race for the Dateline story. So it's really got nothing to do with Scrublands except for a journalist from outside going into a town that he knows nothing about, a rather isolated town, a rather insular town, and digging down and finding it. So I think that's where the idea of Martin arriving in the town came from, and then the story evolved from there.
Okay. So next question is, what advice do you have for young writers?
I could speak for a long time on this. I think the best advice I could give is enjoy it. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. And remember, the most important thing is the work. It's not you. So if you're having self-doubts or whatever, and it can be quite a long process. It's the work that matters. So concentrate on the work. And there's a lot of peripheral stuff about being a writer in the writing community, a lot of social media, or all that sort of stuff. But really, if you just concentrate on trying to tell a good story, don't try and impress people. Don't think about impressing publishers. Don't think about writing bestsellers. Just try and write the best book you can and concentrate on that and try and block out all the rest. I think that's the best advice I could give.
Okay. Next question is, have you got any ideas for books that aren't about Martin?
Yeah, I'm actually thinking the next one may not be about Martin. It doesn't mean that Trust will be the last book with Martin and Mandy, but I might give them a break. I'd like to try some other things. There's two types. You know, you walk into a bookstore, and one of the biggest sections there is that kind of crime, thriller, suspense, whatever they call it. But there's within that genre, there's a whole lot of subgenres. There's the out and out thriller. Often in a thriller, for example, you know who the bad guys are, but there's some kind of countdown. You know, the hero's racing to, you know, save the city or the girl or whatever. To be honest, that doesn't really interest me. But another type of book is the one where there isn't a traditional outside protagonist, like a Martin Scarsden or a police officer. Sort of psychological thrillers. So there's been some very good ones lately. There's The Woman in the Window and The Girl on the Train. Couple of Australian writers have done some really good ones, particularly Christian White's books, The Nowhere Child and The Wife and the Widow are great. There's a few others. J.P. Pomare's done books like that. There's a new one called The Safe Place by Anna Downs. So they're not your traditional protagonists. They're more one-offs. You typically wouldn't get a sequel because, you know, you've learned everything. But I quite like those. I like reading those books. So I think I'd probably like to have a shot at one of those at some point too.
Okay. Now I've got two questions. They're slightly different, but they are related. So the first question is, what experiences did you rely on to set the scenes for Scrubland? The setting felt very realistic.
So I wrote two non-fiction books. One's called The River and one's called The Coast. And if you like, The River gave me the setting for Scrublands and The Coast gave me the setting. I helped give me the setting for Silver. So in The River, it's like travel writing, told in the first person. And during the height of the millennial drought, I travelled right through the Murray-Darling Basin trying to explain what was happening there, and ended up writing not just about the environment and climate change, but Indigenous history, cultural history, the importance of the bush. And I spent a week out on the Hay Plain. Now, if people from Sydney or Canberra, if they drive through to Adelaide, will typically go out through Hay. So it's out, I guess, the northern Mallee sort of area. And the land out there is dead flat. Very few trees, if any, some trees along river lines, and that's about it. To the point that if you stand on the roof of your car, you can kind of see the curvature of the earth. So that gave me that idea. And I was in an irrigation town that looks nothing like Riversend, but it did have this one thing in common. It was an irrigation town and the river was bone dry. And you can imagine the financial impact that would have on an irrigation town. And that gave me the idea and the setting. The town itself that I spent time in was a little town called Cool, but it's quite spread out, as towns are there, because there's so much space. And I wanted a much more condensed town so Martin could walk around and run into people and whatever. And the Scrublands themselves, there's nothing like that out there. That's kind of imported. It's probably, you know, impressions of the Pilliga Scrub, which is right up in kind of northern New South Wales, inland there, Coonabarabran. But the core idea of the irrigation town with no water was from writing that book.
Okay. And the second, I think you've probably answered the next question, but I'll read it out anyway. I felt that when I was reading Scrublands, at the town of Riversend was one that I'd driven through on road trips. It felt so real. And so it just goes on to say, was there any town or towns that Riversend was based upon? I think you probably...
No, so just to clarify, the landscape and the setting, absolutely. But the town itself, the shape of it, whatever, no. And this is, you know, all the books have maps in the front, okay? And the one in Silver of Port Silver is it's a more complicated landscape, but it sort of evolved along with the plot along with the plot. And so, for example, in Silver, there's a place called Hummingbird Beach, and it needed to be far enough out of town that there'd be no mobile phone reception, because every time Martin drives back into town, his phone lights up and he gets messages. So it's shaped by the plot. Trust, again, has a fantastic map by the same Melbourne-based artist, Alex Potocznik. There he is there. But, don't know if you can see it, but it's not an imagined place. It's actually Sydney, but it's not tourist Sydney for sure. And it's kind of an imagined Sydney too. And if you think of all the books you've read, say, about New York, no two books have got the same New York in them. So this is it's a bit grim. It's set post-COVID, so, which is a problem that came up as I was sort of getting into the editing. COVID struck us, and it was a big question that I think a lot of authors are facing at the moment. How do you address COVID? If you're writing a book now that's going to be published next year, do you assume that the vaccine has worked? Do you assume that we're still in the same situation we are now? It's quite a tricky thing. I just read a book that's out. It's not out until next year. I get to read a lot of, uncorrected proofs of books. It's called Dead Letters by a friend of mine, Michael Brissenden, and it's very clever in the way it deals with COVID. I better not give anything more about that away.
Okay, so how does Scrublands come to be published? What was the journey like, getting an agent, finding a publisher, etc.? And I've got a little comment here. Love your work.
Thank you. I'd written these 2 non-fiction books, well received, but didn't sell very much. That was with Melbourne University Press. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to write fiction, I might try and see if I can get an agent. And this friend, Michael, I just mentioned, had an agent at Grace Heifetz at Curtis Brown in Sydney. And so I sent her a copy, asked whether she'd have a look. She said she would. I think more of a favour to Michael. Fortunately for me, she didn't have time to read it, and her assistant read the first draft of Scrublands, really liked it. A guy actually called Benjamin Stevenson, who has now written 2 crime books himself, one called Greenlight that came out, and he's got a new one coming out shortly. He said, it's great, but it doesn't resolve. So I went backwards and forward. I said to Grace, please don't read it until I do a rewrite, which I did. Anyway, she took me on board. She put it out, and this is the great advantage an agent has, is that he or she can approach multiple publishers at the same time. And she got a great response. There was, half a dozen publishers wanted to read it. I think in large part, by that time, The Dry had been published, Jane Harper's book, and was a huge success. I hadn't read The Dry, and neither had Grace, so we both furiously read it, and were relieved to find that, essentially the similarities were fairly superficial. Anyway, around this time, I got sacked. So I actually, before I finished at Fairfax, I got a new job as a political advisor. And that started my meteoric career as a political advisor, which lasted for 3 weeks. And the reason it only lasted 3 weeks is after that I could quit, because on this most remarkable day, Grace had orchestrated an auction for the book, and I still remember it really, really clearly, because it was kind of like the moment my life changed. I was in this deserted office in Parliament House. Everyone had left. Parliament was over for the week. And Grace started going through the bids that we'd got. And by the end, I was kind of laughing, crying, dancing, whatever, because she'd managed to get this fantastic deal. And then the same thing happened in the UK and the same thing happened in America. It's extremely unusual. It might happen no times in a year, or it might happen once or twice a year that you get a book coming out that a lot of publishers are interested in, which means that they'll pay more for the book. So that was my journey, and I was absolutely gobsmacked because I'd written these 2 non-fiction books that I was extremely proud of, but hadn't earned out their advance, nowhere near. So that's what I was expecting when I went to Grace. I just thought I might get a slightly bigger advance. That was it. So it came as this most amazing surprise.
So I've got another question here. It's really about location, which you've probably answered, just a question around location for River's End. But I'll just read out the comment. It was such a pleasure to read you having grown up in the Mallee area. So somebody obviously had a special connection with the locations you're talking about. A couple of questions about the future of Martin, which you've touched on. Hi, Chris. Love your book. Can't wait for Trust. Do you think your 4th book will contain the same character? And secondly, have another person said, is asking, having read Scrublands and Silver, sitting here anticipating the pleasure I'm sure I will experience. What of the future will Martin Scarsden continuing?
So as I said, I'm thinking maybe the next book won't have Martin and Mandy in them. But there might be a couple of characters from the same, Martin might be there, just mentioned once or twice. Maybe he writes a newspaper story, something like that. But I haven't finished with them. I did see a report that said that Trust was the final book with Martin and Mandy. That's not the intention for sure. So I think the next one will be with different characters. But I think there's much more to explore there. One of the things in Trust is we see more about, as I said, we get Mandy's point of view as well, but we also learn about her past. So we know from Scrublands that she left Riversend when she was, about 18 maybe, and she returned when she was about 28 to look after her ill mother. So there's a 10-year gap there. What happened to her, between the ages of 18 and 28. So we find out in Trust, we find out a lot about that in Trust. So again, there is, even though the style of Trust is somewhat different, it still has that kind of emotional journey kind of side to it, although this time much more with Mandy than Martin. I think there is more, though, to tell with that story. I don't want to overdo it. I need to let them brew away, give them a bit of peace and quiet, let their boy Liam get a bit older, that sort of thing. But I'm definitely not done with them.
Next question. In the book, Martin talks about how he missed journalism. Do you miss journalism?
Not a lot, to be honest. Every now and then I do. I don't. One of the things I really liked when I was a journalist, being overseas, was not so much the travel, is that I could just concentrate on that. I could spend weeks on a story, and that was fantastic. But I'm not sure I want to be. I don't want to be in Beirut. I don't want to be in Moscow. Not working as a journalist. Like all of us, I think I miss travelling. The other part of my career I spent covering politics, and by the end I was kind of over it, I think. But on a big day, when things are really happening in politics, I kind of wish I was there on the inside and seeing what was going on, which people have asked me, you spend all this time, going in and out of the press gallery, which I did. I originally worked in the old Parliament House, 30 years ago or something like that. People asked me, well, why don't you write a political thriller? And part of it was because by the time I left, I I had sort of politics and reporting politics up to here. But I think the longer I'm away from it, the more I miss it. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if in a year or two I did write a political thriller. So, which might be, I think, as close to going back to journalism as I'll get.
And funny you should mention that because there is a question here. Is there any chance you have a politically orientated book in you based on your experience in Canberra? So it is brewing there, is it? Or
yeah, look, I think I will, but it's, I don't know. I don't know what the story is yet, and how. One of the questions I need to ask is how realistic I would want it to be, or whether it can be more. Sometimes not knowing a lot about a subject can be liberating as a writer. So there are writers who do enormous amounts of research, and for some writers that definitely helps. But sometimes you read a book and it's almost like, they've researched it too much because there's just too much detail about process. Someone's studied or gone and sat in on an autopsy, so you get 4 pages of detail when maybe a sentence or two would count. So I think in writing politics, I'd have to sort of go, hang on, I need a good story is more important than complete accuracy. And in fact, I think if you're telling a good story, if it has that sort of feel of authenticity, sometimes that impression of verisimilitude is actually more important than being accurate.
Yeah. So the next question is, the opening scene of Scrublands was riveting. Has Scrublands and/or Silver been picked up for films?
Yes, Scrublands has been optioned by 2 really good Australian production companies, Easy Tiger and Rev Lover. Easy Tiger is the company that made the Jack Irish films, made Sunshine, made Rake, so very accomplished. And it's being developed. There's some good writers there. And then they have, should that go ahead, then they've got an option to do Silver and probably subsequent books as well. A lot of books get optioned. Doesn't mean it will necessarily be made. They need to get backing, but they've got backing from Stan, the streaming service, which I'm very happy about because I actually like binge watching, particularly like crime series, whatever, rather than, getting ads breaking things up and whatever. But when and if it will be made, I've got no real idea. But I hope it will be. Yeah, I think COVID has disrupted the film industry in a big way. It seems to be as if production is starting to come back, but who knows?
Yeah. Just a follow-up question to that: Would you be interested in writing the screenplay for an adaptation?
I'd like to be involved a bit. I wouldn't like to be actually writing the scenes or the dialogues because there are people who can do it better than I can. But there are one of the writers who's working on it is a woman called Felicity Packard, who I know her husband well. She's one of the original writers on Underbelly. She did Wolf Creek. She was one of the creators of Pine Gap, very experienced. She was explaining to me that Scrublands is told very much from Martin's point of view, and you can see what he's thinking. Well, you can't do that on TV. The camera's got to be more impersonal. You might have scenes with, where Martin isn't there, for example. So I think it's important that screenwriters have that freedom to make it their own. I think where I could be useful is, say, if they wanted to cut a scene, I could go, look, that's fine, but there's one little element in it that's important to the plot. So what about put it in this scene over there? Or the other thing, if they wanted to extend it. So it's being developed as a 6 one-hour series. which I'm really happy about because I think there's too much happening in Scrublands to fit in a kind of feature film length. And, you know, I think TV is much better at drawing out character. So, yeah, I think I'd like to be involved, but perhaps not centrally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And who would you want to play Martin and Mandy?
I get asked this all the time, and I just don't know. I don't have anyone particularly in mind. I kind of like if it was sort of maybe lesser known actors who could make the role their own. I was fortunate last year. It seems like a lifetime ago. I went to the UK twice, and I ended up doing some events with some very, very famous British crime writers, Val McDermott and Anne Cleves, who's the author of the Vera Stanhope books and the Shetland books. And I asked her about that, and she said her Shetland books, the lead character is a guy called Jimmy Perez, and in the books he's very dark, and he's rumoured to be, you know, the descendant of a Spanish sailor who was shipwrecked in the Shetland Islands. And she says, much as she admires the actor who plays Jimmy Perez in a TV show, he's very blonde, and she can't quite get her mind around him when she's writing the books. She says the absolute opposite is the case with Vera. And now that when she writes the books with Vera in them, all she can see is the wonderful actor who plays the role in the TV show. So hopefully in a few years' time, when I think of Martin, I'll be thinking of the TV actor. One of the things about Martin too is, I don't know if people have realised this, is because it's being told so much from his point of view, you don't get a description of him. There's a period, there's one scene in Scrublands where he's looking at himself in the mirror. But, you know, if you look at yourself in the mirror, you don't describe yourself because you're so familiar with your face. So what he sees is that his eyes are red from the bushfire smoke, or he's sunburnt and he's looking a bit jowly, but that's about it. So it's a really open book about what he actually looks like. You know that he either is or has been quite handsome, but I think that's about it.
So next question, you've captured the scenery and character of Australia brilliantly in Scrublands and Silver. Would you be interested in writing a book set outside of Australia, and if so, where?
To be honest, I haven't thought about it. I am very well travelled. I've been to some very weird and wonderful places, you know, in my career as a journalist. So it's possible. I know a lot of people try to write books set in America to appeal to that market. It really hasn't occurred to me though. I think, who knows? Maybe at some point. I remember Peter Temple wrote one that was based in Germany somewhere. So it's possible, but it's not something that's really exercising my mind at the moment. One of the great things about Australia, of course, is there are so many vastly different landscapes, you know, to explore.
So we've got time for one question, and there's just one comment here I'll read before then. I have to leave now. Thank you so much for an informative talk. Love your books. Cannot wait for Trust. Best wishes for your future. That's Ian from the UK, I think. So.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Ian.
Booked in from the UK. So, so last question. It's actually from left field. Bit off topic, but is Chris a Doctor Who fan? It looks like a Dalek.
I am. I've always liked Doctor Who. It's part of my family history. We used to watch the first Doctor way back when. My brother be hiding behind the couch. And my wife doesn't get it. My son's a bit ambivalent, but my daughter and I, we love watching the Doctor together. So, in fact, that mug is a present from her, my daughter.
Okay. I think there's lots of Doctor Who fans around, Chris. There's certainly a lot at Moonee Valley Libraries. So we'll wrap up tonight, and we just want to thank Chris for his time. It's been really informative. I've certainly enjoyed it, and I think everybody who's hooked in tonight has enjoyed it as well. On behalf of everyone tonight, I'd like to thank you for your insights. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks Steve for handling all the technical side tonight and keeping us on air. And we hope to see you all again for the next lot of events. Good night and keep safe, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.